22 people disappeared at a music festival, but 10 years later, a hidden mass grave was uncovered. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Emily Matthews checked her refrigerator calendar for the 5th time that July morning. The Sun Valley Music Festival was circled in red, with small musical note doodles scattered around it. At 22, a resident nurse at Burlington General Hospital, Emily had been saving for months for this moment. Her modest downtown apartment reflected her priorities. Walls adorned with posters from previous festivals, a bookshelf filled with medical textbooks, and the wooden box where she kept the colorful wristbands from every event she had ever attended. The morning sunlight streamed through her kitchen window, illuminating the organized chaos of her packing process. Her backpack lay open on the dining table, surrounded by neatly folded clothes, sunscreen bottles, and a compact first aid kit, a habit from her medical training she couldn't shake. Ready for the best weekend of the year? Justin Reynolds' voice crackled through her phone as Emily double-checked her backpack for the final time. Justin, her friend since high school, would be one of the 21 young people in their group meeting at the festival. Most of them came from middle-class families across Vermont and Massachusetts, college students or recent graduates seeking a break from everyday pressure. Emily smiled as she zipped up her bag. "Been ready since last year, just making sure I haven't forgotten anything important." Her phone chimed with messages from others in the group, everyone's excitement building as departure time approached. Amber was already on the road. Liam and Sarah had left at dawn to secure a good camping spot. The pieces of their meticulously planned weekend were falling into place. Before leaving, Emily paused at the hallway mirror, carefully adjusting the handcrafted flower crown atop her blonde hair. She had spent the previous evening making it with her mother, Margaret, a tradition before every festival. Taking a quick selfie with her brightest smile, she sent it to her mom with the message, "Heading out now, love you, back Sunday night." Almost instantly, Margaret replied with a heart emoji and, "Be careful, let me know when you arrive." Emily glanced around her apartment one last time, her life temporarily on pause. The medical textbook on her nightstand remained bookmarked on page 143, waiting for her return. Her hospital scrubs hung neatly in the closet. The calendar on her refrigerator showed upcoming hospital shifts and a birthday dinner planned for next month. 2 hours later, Emily's car rolled into the sprawling rural area where Sun Valley was held, an idyllic location nestled between verdant hills. The festival was in its 3rd year and had been rapidly gaining popularity under the direction of Hoffman Entertainment, led by respected music producer Gordon Hoffman. As she approached, Emily could see uniformed security personnel checking wristbands and searching bags at the entrances. The reunion with her friends at the designated campsite was jubilant. Hugs were exchanged, tents were methodically erected under Emily's guidance, and plans were made for which performances to see first. Their campsite soon became a colorful array of tents, coolers, and camp chairs, their home for the next 3 days. Friday passed in a blur of music, laughter, and photos. The atmosphere was electric, with thousands of attendees moving between stages, food vendors, and art installations. Emily and her friends documented everything, their social media accounts filling with images of their festival experience. Saturday afternoon brought even more excitement as the headline acts prepared to take the main stage. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the festival grounds as Justin captured what would be the last image of Emily alive, smiling broadly, adjusting her flower crown, with the main stage visible in the background. "I'll catch up with you guys after the next set," Emily shouted to Amber and Liam around 7:30 p.m., moving away toward the portable toilets. Amber later remembered seeing Emily briefly speaking with a professional-looking security guard before disappearing into the crowd. The next show ended at 9:15 p.m. The friends gathered at their meeting point, but Emily wasn't there. Initially, they weren't concerned. Cell reception was notoriously poor at the venue, and they assumed she had run into other acquaintances. By 11:45 p.m., worry had begun to set in. Emily hadn't appeared at the meeting point and wasn't responding to messages. Amber and Justin started walking through the festival area, asking if anyone had seen her and showing her photo. A bartender mentioned seeing a blonde with a flower crown being escorted by 2 security guards to a restricted area, but he wasn't sure if it was Emily. Around 2 a.m., now visibly concerned, Justin and 3 friends checked the festival's medical center to see if Emily had been treated there. No record of her appeared in the logs. Upon returning to the campsite, they noticed something disturbing. Amber and 4 more friends from their group had also vanished without leaving any messages or traces. At 3:17 a.m., Margaret Matthews's phone rang. It was Justin, his voice trembling. "Mrs. Matthews, Emily's gone, and she's not the only one." The following hours were chaotic. Margaret and her husband David immediately drove to the festival, arriving at dawn. They found Justin and the remaining group members giving statements to visibly overwhelmed local police officers. The festival administration had quickly set up a crisis center, but the response seemed disorganized. What initially appeared to be a case of lost young people transformed into something more sinister when the final count revealed that 22 young people had disappeared on the same night, all between the ages of 18 and 25, predominantly white women. At midnight, with the last show of the night ending and no sign of Emily for more than 4 hours, Justin tried calling her phone for the 10th time when he spotted something disturbing. Another security guard discreetly escorting a disoriented-looking young woman behind a VIP tent, and he could swear he saw the same flower crown that Emily had been wearing. Justin's heart pounded as he pushed through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the VIP tent where he'd seen the security guard escorting the girl with the flower crown. The last show of the night was ending, crowds of intoxicated festival goers streaming toward the campgrounds, making his progress difficult as he fought against the human current. "Excuse me, sorry, I need to get through," he repeated, shouldering past groups of laughing 20-somethings, the bass from the final performance still reverberating through the ground beneath his feet. By the time he reached the VIP area, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. 2 burly security guards stood at the entrance, arms crossed, faces impassive under the harsh glow of overhead lights. "My friend was just brought in here," Justin said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Blonde girl with a flower crown. I need to check if she's okay." The taller guard shifted his stance, subtly blocking Justin's view of the tent's interior. "Area's restricted, kid. Back to the show." "But I just saw someone who looked like my friend being brought in here," Justin insisted, standing taller. "She seemed out of it, like something was wrong." "Nobody's been brought in here," the second guard stated flatly. "And the show's ending. Move along." Justin hesitated, knowing something wasn't right, but uncertain what to do. Their posture made it clear that pushing further would only lead to trouble. With a reluctant nod, he backed away, pulling out his phone to try Emily's number again. Straight to voicemail, just like the previous 9 attempts. At 12:40 a.m., he returned to their designated meeting point, hoping beyond reason that Emily would be there, laughing about some misunderstanding. Instead, he found only half of their original group, all wearing expressions of growing concern under the dim light of the festival's lanterns. "Any sign of her?" asked Ryan, sitting on a cooler with his phone in hand. Justin shook his head, then froze as Liam's words registered. "Amber's not back either, and I can't reach Sarah, Kevin, or Michael. No one's seen them since the 9 o'clock show." The realization descended on the group like a physical weight. 1 missing friend could be explained away. 5 was a pattern that couldn't be ignored. "Something's wrong," Justin said, his voice barely audible over the distant music and crowd noise. "We need to split up and look for them." By 1:15 a.m., they had organized into pairs, agreeing to check different areas of the festival grounds. Justin and Liam headed directly for the medical tent, a sprawling white structure near the main entrance where festival staff treated everything from sunburn to drug overdoses. Inside, the scene was surprisingly orderly. Several exhausted-looking nurses moved between rows of cots where mostly intoxicated attendees were being monitored. A harried volunteer at the entrance, clipboard in hand, looked up as they approached. "We're looking for our friends," Justin explained, showing pictures on his phone. "Emily Matthews, Amber Collins, Sarah Walsh, Kevin Patel, and Michael Donovan. They've been missing for hours. We're really worried." The volunteer flipped through several pages on her clipboard, squinting in the fluorescent light. "No patients with those names have been checked in tonight. People get separated all the time at these events, especially when reception is bad. They're probably at another campsite, made some new friends." Her dismissive tone intensified Justin's growing sense of dread. As they exited the medical tent, Liam voiced what they were both thinking. "That doesn't sound like Emily or Amber. They wouldn't just disappear without telling anyone." By 2:30 a.m., the remaining group had reconvened at their campsite, exchanging information with increasing urgency. None of their missing friends had been seen. No messages had arrived. All calls went straight to voicemail, as if their phones had been simultaneously turned off. "I talked to a bartender near the west stage," said Chelsea, her voice shaking slightly. "He said he saw a blonde girl with a flower crown being escorted by security to some staff area, but he couldn't say for sure it was Emily." Justin attempted to contact festival security through the emergency number listed on their wristbands, only to receive an automated message stating all lines were busy. With each passing minute, the situation felt less like a misunderstanding and more like something deeply wrong. At 3:17 a.m., sitting alone in his tent, the distant thumping of after-parties still audible, Justin made the hardest call of his life. His hands trembled as he dialed Margaret Matthews' number, knowing he was about to shatter a family's peace. The phone rang 3 times before a sleepy voice answered. "Hello? Justin? Is everything okay?" He took a deep breath. "Mrs. Matthews, Emily's gone. And she's not the only one." The hours that followed passed in a blur of activity and growing horror. Margaret and David Matthews arrived at the festival grounds as dawn broke over the surrounding hills, their Honda Civic kicking up dust as it pulled into the now half-empty parking area. The morning light revealed abandoned tents, scattered trash, and the remnants of the previous night's celebration. Justin spotted them immediately, Margaret's face pale with worry, David's jaw set in determination as they navigated through the muddy pathways toward the campsite. By then, local police officers had arrived, taking statements with notepads that seemed woefully inadequate for the seriousness of the situation. By 7:30 a.m., festival management had set up an improvised operations center in a large tent near the main entrance. More families began to arrive, each one's hopeful expression crumbling as they learned the scope of what was happening. The scene inside the tent grew more chaotic with each passing hour, parents clutching photos of smiling children, siblings making frantic phone calls, officers attempting to organize information. Sheriff Thomas Walden, a middle-aged man with deep lines etched around his eyes, addressed the gathering with careful words. "We're treating these as concerning disappearances, but there's currently no concrete evidence of any crime." Margaret scanned the room, taking in the growing number of desperate families. Each face reflected her own fear, each clutched photo showing another young person with a bright smile. As her gaze moved across the tent, she locked eyes with a woman in a discreet suit methodically, photographing everything with a calculating expression. When their eyes met, the woman approached with purposeful strides. "Vanessa Cortez, investigative journalist," she said in a low voice, extending her hand. "I think I know what happened to your daughter, and it's not the first time something like this has occurred at a Hoffman Entertainment Festival." Margaret stared at the journalist's business card, turning it over in her fingers as Vanessa Cortez led her to a makeshift cafe set up near the festival grounds. The morning sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the trampled grass and abandoned tents. David had stayed behind to coordinate with other families, his banker's methodical mind already organizing search efforts while she followed this unexpected lead. "I've been tracking Hoffman Entertainment for nearly 2 years," Vanessa explained, opening her tablet as they settled at a rickety table. What happened here isn't isolated. Look at these. The screen displayed news clippings. 19-year-old vanishes during Fall Rhythm Festival from 2 years ago, and police end search for missing college students at festival from the previous year. Margaret's throat tightened as she swiped through the articles, each featuring young faces not unlike Emily's. Always the same. Profile, Vanessa said, leaning forward and lowering her voice. Young women, healthy, middle class, no visible tattoos, no known medical conditions. The disappearances never reached double digits before, so they stayed local news. But 22 at once? That's going to be impossible to bury. Margaret clutched her coffee cup, the liquid inside untouched and cooling. You think someone is targeting these people specifically, but why? And how could security not notice? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Vanessa replied, glancing around cautiously, and I think security might be part of it. At 1 p.m., Gordon Hoffman emerged from a black SUV at the festival's main gate, surrounded by assistants and lawyers. News vans had begun appearing, satellite dishes raised like periscopes, scanning for tragedy. Cameras flashed as the music producer, a middle-aged man in expensive yet understated clothing, approached the microphones. We are devastated by these events, Hoffman stated, his face a mask of appropriate concern. We've hired an external security company for the festival. We're fully cooperating and providing all available camera footage to authorities. From the edge of the crowd, Margaret and David watched skeptically. On split screens across the country, viewers could see police with dogs searching the wooded areas surrounding the festival, while families clutched photos of the missing. Why are they combing the forest when witnesses say they saw security personnel escorting these kids away? David demanded of a police lieutenant later that afternoon, frustration evident in his normally composed voice. We're wasting precious time on the wrong search area. The officer's non-committal response only fueled David's growing anger. Meanwhile, Margaret observed police officers cataloging belongings left in the missing people's tents. Emily's backpack with her meticulously packed first aid kit still intact, her sleeping bag neatly rolled, her festival schedule annotated in her precise handwriting. As evening approached, a new lead emerged. Kyle Harrison, a 20-year-old photography student, approached Justin and Margaret near the campsite, nervously clutching his professional camera. I was reviewing my shots from last night, he explained, opening his laptop. I think I might have accidentally captured something. The image on screen was dark, taken around 8 p.m. Two silhouettes escorted a figure that could have been Emily toward an area behind the stages. Margaret leaned closer, asking Kyle to enhance the image, but each enlargement only degraded the quality further, making it impossible to identify any distinguishing features on the uniformed men. Can I get a copy of this? Margaret asked, already thinking of showing it to the officers in charge. While Margaret pursued this new lead, David stepped away to make a difficult call. Standing near the festival entrance, phone pressed to his ear, he spoke with his bank manager in Burlington. I need emergency leave, he stated firmly. My daughter's missing. No, we don't know when or if. His voice broke for the first time since they'd received the devastating call from Justin. By the fourth day, patterns were emerging that couldn't be ignored. The families had transformed a nearby community hall into their headquarters, walls covered with photos of the 22 missing young people, their smiling faces creating a gallery of interrupted lives. Margaret stood before an improvised map where family members had marked the last known locations of their loved ones. They're all clustered near the VIP or medical areas, she noted to Caroline Baker, Lauren's mother. That can't be coincidence. Outside, a maintenance worker was describing what he'd seen to a detective who seemed more interested in his coffee than the testimony. White vans with no markings left through the service exit. During the early morning hours, 3 of them. I figured they were band equipment or something. The detective nodded absently, making minimal notes. This dismissive attitude had become painfully familiar to the families over the past few days. Later that afternoon, a tense meeting between families and authorities revealed the growing divide in approach. Sheriff Walden stood at the front of the room, defensive posture betraying his discomfort. "We're pursuing multiple lines of investigation," he insisted, avoiding eye contact with most of the gathered families. "But we need to be methodical. Rushing leads to mistakes." The room temperature seemed to drop as David Matthews rose from his chair, his normally controlled demeanor cracking under the weight of 4 days of inadequate responses. "Our children were taken by someone," he stated with quiet intensity, "and you're wasting time searching the woods for people who aren't there anymore." That evening, as Margaret returned to their temporary hotel room, her phone rang with an unknown number. When she answered, an electronically distorted voice spoke. "If you want to see your daughter again, stop talking to journalist Cortez. She's already caused enough problems." And before Margaret could respond, the voice added, "Emily was wearing a silver pendant with the initials EM the day she disappeared, a detail that hadn't been released in any official report." Margaret's trembling hand nearly dropped the phone. The anonymous caller knew about Emily's pendant, a graduation gift that hadn't been mentioned in any report. The distorted voice, the threat, the intimate knowledge of her daughter. It all confirmed her worst fears. This was no random disappearance. "Who is this?" she demanded, but the line had already gone dead. 1 month later, Margaret stood in the doorway of Emily's untouched apartment, a shrine to interrupted life. The morning light filtered through drawn blinds, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. On the bedside table, Emily's book remained bookmarked on page 143, waiting for its reader to return. Clothes still hung in the open closet, arranged by color, as Emily had always preferred. Margaret sank onto the bed, clutching her phone, her thumb hovering over the voicemail she'd replayed countless times since the disappearance. "Hi, Mom. Just calling to confirm I'm picking Abby up from school tomorrow. Love you." Emily's voice, full of life, preserved in digital amber from a week before the festival. Across town, Abigail Matthews sat rigid in the school counselor's office, staring at her hands, while the gentle-voiced woman explained the situation to her parents over the phone. "She had another panic attack in PE today," the counselor said. "It's becoming a pattern we need to address." At 16, Abby had always lived somewhat in her accomplished sister's shadow. Now she was drowning in her absence. Her attendance had plummeted. Friends reported she refused to attend any social gatherings, paralyzed by the fear that she too might vanish. Meanwhile, at Burlington National Bank, David Matthews faced his own crossroads. "I need to extend my leave," he stated to Richard, his supervisor, the words heavy with resignation. Richard's sympathetic expression carried an undercurrent of concern. "It's been a month, David. Maybe it's time to consider—" "Don't finish that sentence, Richard," David interrupted, his normally composed demeanor hardening. "My daughter is alive until proven otherwise." The police station offered little comfort that afternoon. Margaret observed the missing persons posters, once prominently displayed at the entrance, now relegated to a side bulletin board, partially obscured by notices of more recent crimes. The detective assigned to Emily's case was hunched over paperwork for a fresh homicide. Sheriff Walden emerged from his office, defensive, posture already in place before Margaret could speak. "We're still actively investigating, Mrs. Matthews, but understand we have limited jurisdiction and resources." Back home, their living room had metamorphosed into an impromptu command center. Maps covered the walls, detailed timelines stretched across tables, and dossiers on each missing person were stacked in precise order. This methodical approach was David's way of maintaining control in a situation that offered none. That evening, the first formal meeting of the Sun Valley Families Association convened at the community church. 20 families gathered, their faces etched with the same hollow expression that Margaret recognized in her own mirror each morning. "We need someone who can speak for all of us," Caroline Baker suggested, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Someone the media will listen to." All eyes turned to Margaret. Though public speaking had never been her forte, the weight of those expectant gazes settled on her shoulders like a mantle she couldn't refuse. "I'm not a public speaker," she admitted, "but I'll do whatever it takes for Emily." That night, as she lay awake beside David's sleeping form, Margaret replayed the anonymous call in her mind for the 100th time. The detail about Emily's pendant nagged at her. Was it a kidnapper flaunting intimate knowledge of his victim? Or someone inside the investigation, reaching out with information they couldn't share officially? The following day brought the Matthews family's new normal into sharp relief. Dinner was a silent affair. Abigail pushed food around her plate without eating. David compulsively checked notifications on his phone, jumping slightly at each ping. Margaret found herself automatically setting a third plate before realizing her mistake and removing it with barely contained tears. Across town, Vanessa Cortez sat in her cramped newspaper office, walls papered with information about Hoffman entertainment festivals. An unmarked envelope had arrived that morning, containing documents about Sentinel Group, the security company contracted for Sun Valley. The company was registered just 3 months before the festival, Vanessa explained the next day, meeting Margaret at a discreet cafe away from prying eyes. No previous business history, and the address is just a P.O. box. She slid several photos across the table, security personnel captured in festival attendees' social media posts. 5 of these men, identified by witnesses, don't appear in any official company records. Later that night, reviewing Emily's disappearance for the 1,000th time, Margaret opened the final selfie her daughter had sent. Something caught her eye that they'd overlooked before. In the mirror behind Emily, partially visible, was a man watching through the apartment window. When she enlarged the image on her computer, she clearly recognized the Sentinel Group uniform. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the enlarged image on her computer screen. The man in the Sentinel Group uniform was unmistakable, watching through Emily's apartment window just before she left for the festival. This wasn't coincidence, it was surveillance. "David," she called, her voice cracking, "you need to see this." By morning, Margaret was standing in Sheriff Walden's office, the printed image clutched in her hand. She pushed it across his desk, pointing to the reflection. "This man was watching my daughter's apartment before she disappeared," she insisted, her finger tapping on the uniform insignia. "He's wearing a Sentinel Group uniform. They were targeting her specifically." Sheriff Walden's expression remained impassive as he glanced at the photo, then pushed it back toward Margaret with a dismissive sigh. "Probably a delivery person or building maintenance, Mrs. Matthews," he said, not even bothering to examine it closely. "We're investigating concrete patterns, not reflections in mirrors." That afternoon, the Sun Valley Families Association gathered in their makeshift headquarters, frustration palpable in the cramped space. Caroline Baker paced the worn carpet, her normally composed demeanor crumbling. "The police are deliberately stonewalling us," she declared. "We need professional help, someone not bound by local politics or jurisdictional concerns." After a unanimous vote, despite the daunting cost, the association contacted Mason Reed, a 53-year-old former FBI agent specializing in missing persons cases. His reputation preceded him: methodical, thorough, and unflinching in pursuit of truth. 2 days later, Reed entered the Matthews living room, his military posture and calculating gaze taking in the maps and timelines covering the walls. His salt and pepper hair was cropped short, his handshake firm as he greeted Margaret and David. "You've done impressive work organizing the information," he commented, studying their timeline. "Tell me what the police aren't telling you." "They're dismissing crucial evidence," Margaret explained, showing him the photograph. "This man was watching Emily's apartment before she left for the festival." Reed examined the image carefully, unlike Walden's cursory glance. "I'll need to see her apartment," he stated. "Today, if possible." That afternoon, Reed and Margaret stood in Emily's apartment, the former agent methodically checking locks, windows, and access points while wearing latex gloves. The space remained untouched, preserved in the hope of Emily's return. "Someone was definitely watching from outside," Reed confirmed, photographing a partial fingerprint on the exterior window ledge with specialized equipment. And recently, too, this print hasn't been exposed to the elements long. His practiced eye noted other subtle disturbances, slight traces of powder residue on light switches, the positioning of items slightly altered from earlier photos Margaret had provided. These are signs of surveillance, he explained. Someone was monitoring her movements, learning her patterns. Across town, Vanessa Cortez cornered a nervous IT technician who had worked at the festival. How exactly did the only 2 cameras covering the area of the disappearances experience simultaneous failures? She demanded, her recorder visible on the table between them. I just fix equipment, he mumbled, eyes darting toward the exit. But if you're asking me if those cameras failing together was coincidence, his voice trailed off meaningfully. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, tension filled Walden's cramped office as state detectives Robert Caldwell and Diana Lynn presented official documentation. Both were seasoned investigators in their 50s, with the weathered expressions of people who had seen too much. We're taking over the Sun Valley disappearances investigation, Caldwell stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Walden's face tightened, fingers gripping his desk edge. My department is perfectly capable of conducting this investigation. We don't need state interference. 22 missing young adults and minimal progress after a month suggests otherwise, Lynn replied coolly, already examining the case files stacked on Walden's desk. That evening, in the Matthews home, the strain of the ongoing nightmare manifested in the growing distance between Margaret and David. Past midnight, Margaret stood in Emily's room, gently touching her daughter's clothes, while David remained in his makeshift office, methodically updating spreadsheets tracking search expenses and investigation timelines. When they finally encountered each other in the hallway, David's expression was grave. We've spent almost all our savings on private investigators and publicity campaigns. We need to be realistic about our finances. Margaret stared at him, her exhaustion giving way to angry disbelief. Realistic? It's our daughter, David. I'd sell this house if it would bring Emily back. David's shoulders slumped. And then what? Live in our car while continuing a search that might never end? I'm trying to ensure we can sustain this effort. You're preparing for failure, Margaret shot back. I'm fighting for our daughter's life. Their argument dissolved into pained silence, both too exhausted and heartbroken to continue. They retreated to separate rooms, the gulf between them widening with each passing day without Emily. At 2:17 a.m., Margaret's phone rang in the darkness. She fumbled for it, instantly alert, despite her exhaustion. Mason Reed's normally controlled voice sounded urgent. I think I found something. One of the security guards from the photo we analyzed has been identified as Malcolm Turner, ex-military with a record for human trafficking in Asia. And I just discovered he purchased a new car with cash 3 days after the disappearances. The name Malcolm Turner hung in the air between them. Margaret clutched her phone tighter, suddenly wide awake despite the early hour. A human trafficker? You think he was involved in taking Emily? It's a significant lead, Reed replied, his voice regaining its professional steadiness. I'm looking into his known associates and movements now. Get some rest, Mrs. Matthews. We'll reconvene in the morning. Rest, however, proved impossible. By sunrise, Margaret had made coffee and was poring over her notes when David emerged from his office, where he'd fallen asleep at his desk again. 6 months after the disappearances, the state police had established a dedicated workspace for the Sun Valley case. Detective Robert Caldwell stood before the evidence board that now occupied an entire wall, examining the 22 smiling faces arranged in a grid pattern, connected by red strings to festival photos, witness statements, and timeline markers. Emily Matthews' image remained at the center, her flower crown a haunting reminder of innocence lost. 347 interviews, no concrete leads, Caldwell murmured to Detective Lynn as she entered with fresh coffee. The bags under his eyes had deepened over the months of investigation. Mason Reed arrived moments later, his disciplined posture unchanged, but his expression grimmer than usual. Malcolm Turner used a secondary passport to travel to Mexico 3 days after the disappearances. He registered at a hotel in Cancun and then vanished from our radar. Lynn nodded thoughtfully. That tracks with what we found in the phone records. The cell phones of 18 victims were powered down in a sequential pattern, suggesting coordinated action. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Back in Burlington, Margaret stared at an official letter from Burlington General Hospital. The sterile language inquired about employment status decisions regarding Emily, requesting clarification for insurance purposes. The hospital needed to know, should they continue carrying her on their health plan, or would the Matthews family like to make alternative arrangements? David found Margaret at the kitchen table, the letter crumpled in her fist, tears streaming silently down her face. Without a word, he wrapped his arms around her shoulders, his own eyes reddening. These bureaucratic reminders of Emily's absence had become cruel milestones in their journey. The lease on her apartment, her student loan payments, and now her workplace benefits, all demanding answers the Matthews family didn't have. At the bank later that week, David reviewed their financial statement with growing concern. Red circles marked substantial withdrawals, funds for private investigators, publicity campaigns, Emily's ongoing expenses, and contributions to the association's efforts. Their savings had dwindled alarmingly, with no end to the search in sight. The Sun Valley Families Association had evolved considerably since its formation. They now operated from a small rented office where Caroline Baker monitored the metrics of their Dovberg Sun Valley 22 social media campaign. Professional graphics showcased each missing person, their stories humanized through childhood photos and testimonials from friends and family. The engagement numbers have tripled since last month, Caroline explained to Margaret during their weekly meeting. That CNN interview you did really connected with people. Margaret nodded absently, her attention caught by a television in the corner, broadcasting a surprise announcement from Gordon Hoffman. The music producer, impeccably dressed but visibly thinner than 6 months ago, stood before a forest of microphones. The Sun Valley Music Festival is permanently canceled, Hoffman stated solemnly. Furthermore, we will establish an assistance fund for the families affected by the tragic disappearances. The announcement sparked immediate debate among association members. Some viewed the gesture as an implicit admission of guilt, others as a genuine attempt at atonement. Margaret watched Hoffman's face carefully, studying his expressions for any sign of deception. Meanwhile, Mason Reed had made a crucial discovery regarding the festival's security camera failures. Spread across his desk was a detailed map of the venue with camera positions marked. The cameras that failed created an unmonitored corridor leading to this secondary exit near the supply area. He explained to Lynn and Caldwell, someone deliberately created a blind spot. Reed and Lynn later interviewed a former supply area employee who confirmed their suspicions. Yeah, vans and trucks were coming and going throughout the festival. Nobody checked much, they all had staff passes. Back home, the absence of Emily continued to manifest in painful daily routines. Margaret still occasionally set a third plate at dinner. David avoided walking past his daughter's bedroom. 16-year-old Abigail, once vivacious and outgoing, now attended therapy twice weekly, struggling with paralyzing fear of public spaces. In the kitchen one evening, David reviewed insurance documents while Margaret prepared a simple dinner neither of them would eat with much appetite. If we declare Emily legally missing, we can access her life insurance to fund the continuing search, he suggested cautiously. Margaret's reaction was immediate and visceral. That sounds like giving up, David. Like we're accepting. She won't come back. I'm not giving up, David responded, the weariness in his voice palpable. I'm being practical so we can continue looking. We've nearly depleted our savings. Later that night, Margaret rewatched Hoffman's press conference repeatedly, analyzing every expression and word for hidden meanings. In the background, partially visible behind Hoffman's right shoulder, a man turned away from the cameras, but not before Margaret caught a glimpse of his profile. With a jolt of recognition, she paused the video and leaned closer to the screen. The face belonged to Kenneth Walsh, the chief of police who supervised Sheriff Walden and who had repeatedly denied additional resources for the initial investigation. Margaret's heart pounded as she stared at Kenneth Walsh's face in the frozen video frame. The chief of police who had obstructed the investigation at every turn was somehow connected to Hoffman. This wasn't coincidence, it was conspiracy. "David," she called, her voice echoing through the silent house. "You need to see this." The following morning, Margaret sat across from Detectives Caldwell and Lynn in their office. The printed screenshot spread between them. Caldwell's expression remained skeptical as he examined the image. "It could be coincidence," he suggested. Cautiously, "Walsh is a public figure. He could have been there officially." Lynn leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the photograph. "But why hide from cameras? And why wasn't his presence ever mentioned in any official capacity?" "Walsh was the one who consistently denied resources for the case when it was under local jurisdiction," Margaret pressed. "He's the reason Sheriff Walden couldn't, or wouldn't, investigate properly." Lynn exchanged a meaningful glance with her partner. "It's suspicious enough to warrant discreet investigation. If Walsh is connected to Hoffman, it changes everything about the case." 3 days later, Mason Reed met with Timothy Walsh, no relation to the police chief, at a quiet cafe several towns away from Burlington. The young IT specialist from Hoffman Entertainment constantly checked over his shoulder, his coffee untouched, as nervous fingers tapped against the table. Hoffman always personally selected photos of attendees for VIP passes before shows, Timothy explained in a hushed voice. "Always the same type. Healthy young people between 18 and 25, mostly women. No visible tattoos, no obvious health issues." Reed maintained his composed expression despite the disturbing implications. "Did he ever explain why he was selecting these specific individuals?" "He said they projected the right image for exclusive backstage events," Timothy replied. "But I never saw these events happen, and some of the people he selected weren't even big spenders or influencers. They were just ordinary festival goers." Meanwhile, Detective Lynn had obtained a court order to examine Police Chief Walsh's financial records. In a secure room at the bank, she methodically reviewed statements spanning the months before and after the festival, highlighting regular deposits from a company called Lazarus Ventures. Each deposit is exactly $5,000, made on the first Monday of every month, starting 3 months before Sun Valley and continuing to present, she reported to Caldwell in their office later that day. "If Walsh is involved, we need to be extremely cautious," Caldwell warned during a strategy session with Reed. "He has access to all our investigative materials, can monitor our movements through department resources, and knows exactly what we know." The investigation took a dramatic turn when FBI agents successfully extradited Marcus Donovan from Mexico, while Lynn prepared an interrogation room in a secure federal facility hours from Burlington. Donovan had negotiated partial immunity in exchange for his testimony. "I was hired specifically because of my military background," Donovan explained, his expression grim. "Our instructions were clear. Identify young people matching specific criteria, then discreetly administer sedatives in their drinks or through free samples of products." Lynn maintained her professional demeanor despite her disgust. "Who gave these instructions?" "We received orders through team leaders. I never met whoever was in charge," Donovan replied. "But there was an older, well-dressed man who would occasionally observe the selection process, approving or rejecting candidates through radio communication." The investigation's momentum built rapidly. Financial records linked Lazarus Ventures to a series of shell companies ultimately connected to the Lazarus Medical Research Foundation, an organization purportedly dedicated to groundbreaking research in human life extension. While the detectives pursued these institutional connections, the Matthews family faced another emotional hurdle as the 2-year anniversary of the disappearances approached. Their attorney had called to discuss the possibility of filing for a presumptive death declaration. After 2 years, this would allow you to access Emily's accounts, insurance, and resolve her legal matters, the lawyer explained gently during a meeting. At the bank. This suggestion triggered David's first public emotional breakdown. "My daughter is not dead," he shouted, startling everyone in the conference room. "I will not bury an empty coffin." The outburst shocked Margaret, who had grown accustomed to her husband's stoic approach to their tragedy. In the car afterward, David's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I just can't accept that she's gone." At the 28-month mark after the disappearances, Caroline Baker arrived at the association's office, clutching an envelope she'd received that morning. Her hands trembled as she spread its contents on the conference table. A sheet of white paper with GPS coordinates written in black ink and a small lock of blonde hair secured with clear tape. "The lab confirmed it's consistent with Lauren's DNA," Caroline explained, her voice breaking. "Someone knows where our children are, or where they were." The coordinates pointed to a remote mountain area, approximately 67 kilometers from the festival site. Property records indicated the land belonged to a shell company registered 3 years earlier. When presented with this evidence, police officials initially hesitated. "We need more than anonymous coordinates to justify a full search operation," the department spokesperson explained, classifying the case as exhausted in terms of investigative resources. This reluctance created a final, irreparable break between authorities and the families. With the association's blessing, Reed organized an independent investigation. Armed with only a tenuous authorization from a sympathetic judge and accompanied by David Matthews and 2 other fathers, Reed arrived at the location. They found an apparently abandoned area with a deteriorated hunting cabin. Using metal detectors, they discovered something disturbing. A large area of disturbed soil camouflaged under foliage, and what appeared to be a buried hatch secured with industrial padlocks. "We need warrants and heavy equipment," Reed insisted, forcing the group to return and confront authorities with their discovery. The official response remained evasive until Vanessa Cortez published an explosive story that generated enough public outrage to force action. When forensic teams finally arrived at the site 3 days later, Margaret Matthews watched from a distance, her expression oscillating between hope and terror. The technician's metal detector emitted a sharp signal near the hatch, and when the first shovel of earth was removed, it revealed something no one was prepared to see. The metal object unearthed by the forensic technician wasn't the hatch they had expected, but a silver pendant with the initials EM engraved on its surface, the graduation gift Margaret had given Emily before she became a nurse. David stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside the excavation, his trembling hand reaching for the necklace now sealed in an evidence bag. "That's hers," he whispered, voice cracking. "That's Emily's." The discovery of the pendant was just the beginning. Over the next several hours, forensic teams methodically excavated the area, recovering more personal items with each careful removal of soil. Caroline Baker's strangled sob cut through the mountain air as a technician lifted a familiar beaded bracelet from the dirt, Lauren's favorite, handmade at a summer camp years before. Jason Peterson's distinctive watch with its worn leather band emerged next, followed by Amber Collins's delicate ankle chain with the small dolphin charm she never traveled without. Margaret stood apart from the activity, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if physically holding her body together. Each recovered item represented both confirmation and dread, proof their children had been here, but under what circumstances remained the unanswered question hanging heavily in the crisp mountain air. The excavation continued for 2 weeks, now fully supervised by the FBI, which had assumed jurisdiction after classifying the case as a potential interstate serial crime. The hidden hatch was finally discovered beneath an artificial rock formation, camouflaged by a sophisticated layer of compacted soil and deliberately planted vegetation that had taken root, suggesting long-term planning. When agents finally opened the reinforced metal door, they revealed a narrow tunnel descending approximately 5 meters into the earth. Special Agent Patrick Nolan, a veteran investigator with the FBI's Violent Crimes Division assigned as Operation Coordinator, personally led the first team down with tactical gear and specialized breathing equipment, uncertain what they might encounter below. 3 hours later, Nolan emerged from the tunnel, his expression grimmer than when he'd entered. The families gathered at the perimeter of the excavation site watched anxiously as he approached, removing his protective gear with deliberate slowness that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. The tunnel leads to an underground facility of approximately 200 square meters, he explained to the families gathered in an improvised conference room at a nearby ranger station later. That evening, it's divided into individual cells, a common area, and what appears to be a medical procedures room. His hesitation in choosing the words was not lost on anyone present. We found evidence of prolonged occupation, but the location has been methodically cleaned. Forensic teams are processing biological traces and fingerprints. Margaret's hand found David's across the table, gripping it with painful intensity. Were there, she began, unable to complete the question that terrified her most. No bodies have been found, Nolan confirmed quickly, understanding her fear. The facility appears to have been evacuated in a planned manner. Whoever was using it knew how to minimize evidence. For Margaret, the worst wasn't what had been revealed, but what remained hidden. Where were their children if they weren't here? What had happened in that underground facility? The absence of definitive answers prolonged their torment, extending the limbo of not knowing whether to grieve or hope. That night, David found Margaret in Emily's bedroom, methodically reorganizing their daughter's closet, pulling out summer clothes and carefully folding winter sweaters away. "She'll need these clothes when she comes back," Margaret explained with disturbing calmness, before collapsing into heaving sobs in her husband's arms for the first time since Emily's disappearance. As the 3-year anniversary of the tragedy approached, forensic analysis produced the first significant breakthrough. DNA recovered from a drain in the underground laboratory matched 3 of the missing persons, including Emily. More disturbing still, traces of controlled medications, primarily sedatives, painkillers, and immunosuppressants, were identified on various surfaces throughout the facility. "We're considering multiple hypotheses," Nolan carefully explained to the families gathered once again, including unauthorized experimentation, organ trafficking, or prolonged captivity for other purposes. His clinical words barely disguised the implicit horror. Mason Reed, now working in reluctant cooperation with the FBI, focused on tracing the property ownership. The investigation revealed a network of shell companies that eventually led to an offshore holding, financed by a private medical foundation, the Lazarus Medical Research Foundation. Though apparently legitimate and dedicated to cutting-edge research in human life extension, the foundation had no known physical facilities nor significant scientific publications, despite moving millions annually through its accounts. An elderly woman who lived 5 miles from the site provided another disturbing piece of the puzzle, reporting occasional helicopter activity at night over the past 3 years, always without lights and during new moon phases when darkness was most complete. The families absorbed each new revelation with a mixture of horror and vindication. Their insistence that something sinister had happened to their children was finally being confirmed, yet the truth was more terrifying than many had imagined. As Reed left the FBI field office late one evening, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted, but the message was clear enough to leave the former agent visibly shaken. He immediately drove to the Matthews home, finding Margaret and David still awake despite the late hour. The person who called identified himself as a former doctor from the operation, Reed explained urgently. He said the facility we found was just a collection and initial processing point, and that some of the young people, including Emily, were transferred alive to permanent facilities, where they remain to this day. Reed's revelation about Emily possibly being alive sent shockwaves through the Matthews household. Margaret clutched David's arm, her nails digging in too. His skin as hope and terror battled across her face. "Alive? Are you certain?" Her voice trembled with desperation. "The caller provided details only someone inside would know," Reed explained, his normally composed demeanor shaken, including the layout of the mountain facility and specific medical protocols used there. By morning, the FBI had established a command center specifically dedicated to identifying possible locations where survivors might be held. Large screens displayed financial records projected along one wall, agents meticulously tracing the labyrinthine network of companies connected to the Lazarus Medical Research Foundation. The property was purchased through 5 layers of shell companies, Reed explained to Agent Nolan, pointing to the complex organizational chart they'd assembled. Each transaction designed to obscure ownership, but they all ultimately lead back to Lazarus. Nolan examined documents about the foundation, registered 7 years earlier, ostensibly dedicated to research in human life extension, yet possessing no known physical facilities despite its substantial financial footprint. Its board of directors consisted entirely of lawyers representing anonymous clients, and its published research was minimal and vague, focusing on theoretical concepts rather than experimental results. In the FBI interrogation room, Marcus Donovan, now secured in a witness protection arrangement, provided crucial details about the selection process at the festival. "We were instructed to identify specific young people," he explained, visibly uncomfortable, as agents showed him photographs of the missing. Healthy, no visible tattoos, no complex medical history. The targets had to match exact physical criteria. He described how security personnel would discreetly spray compounds onto victims' drinks or offer free samples of products laced with fast-acting sedatives. The selected ones were taken to the medical area for supposed allergic reactions and transported in fake ambulances. While Donovan claimed ignorance about the victim's ultimate destination, he mentioned an older, well-dressed man who frequently observed the selection process, approving or rejecting candidates through radio communication with the security team leaders. The search for this mysterious observer led investigators back to Gordon Hoffman. Though his company had organized the festival, he had maintained distance from the accusations, protected by layers of employees and advisors who insisted he had no direct operational involvement. Armed with mounting evidence, the FBI obtained warrants to simultaneously search Hoffman's Connecticut residence and his New York office. When agents arrived at his apparently empty mansion, they discovered a panic room in the basement, a secret chamber accessible through a sliding bookcase. Inside, they found a sophisticated monitoring station showing camera feeds from the underground complex, clearly active until recently. More disturbing was a wall covered with photographs of young people, many beyond the 22 missing from Sun Valley, with detailed medical annotations beside each face. Hoffman himself had vanished. His last known location was a private airport in New Jersey, 2 days before the operation. As the manhunt intensified, agents made a chilling discovery at Hoffman's isolated rural property in upstate New York, an improvised yet sophisticated crematorium, carefully hidden inside a converted barn. Forensic analysis confirmed human remains had been incinerated there, though individual identification was practically impossible due to the meticulous cremation process. One technician described the facility as specifically designed to eliminate biological evidence without leaving recoverable traces. For the families, this discovery represented a painful turning point, the first concrete indication that their loved ones might never return alive. Margaret and David Matthews processed this reality differently. She intensified her search for answers, while he began preparing for the inevitable grieving process. 4 days after the operation, the FBI received an anonymous call directing them to an abandoned warehouse in Buffalo. There they found Kenneth Walsh, the police chief who had supervised the initial investigation and was about to retire, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Beside his body, a letter confessed his involvement in obstructing the Sun Valley investigation and directly implicated Hoffman. "I never knew what happened to them," Walsh wrote. "I only ensured certain lines of investigation weren't pursued. I received payments to direct the investigation away from the mountain property. When I realized the extent of what was happening, it was too late. Sarah was my niece. I helped her buy the festival ticket. I sent her to her death. The mention of Sarah Walsh, one of the 22 missing, sent shockwaves through the investigation. The fact that the police chief had unwittingly contributed to his own niece's disappearance, then actively obstructed the investigation, represented a macabre twist no one had anticipated. While the hunt for Hoffman intensified, Mason Reed noticed a pattern in the Lazarus Foundation's finances. Substantial transfers coinciding with other music festivals across different states over the past 5 years. Preliminary investigations into police records revealed previously unconnected cases of young people disappearing at these events, though in smaller numbers, 2 here, 3 there, never enough to establish the pattern that had become impossible to ignore at Sun Valley. Reed presented his theory to the FBI. Sun Valley wasn't the first, it was just where they got too ambitious. 22 at once created the pattern they could no longer hide. The pressure increased when a second anonymous letter arrived at Caroline Baker's residence, containing only 5 typewritten words: "Look for the living, not dead." The following morning brought an unexpected breakthrough. An urgent border report indicated that Gordon Hoffman had been located attempting to enter Canada with false documents, and during his detention, he made only one statement. "You don't understand. Some of them are still alive, being used as continuous sources at 3 different locations, and if I don't check in daily with the code, the termination protocols will be automatically activated." Hoffman's words sent the FBI into immediate action. Within minutes of his capture at the Canadian border crossing, a tactical command center had been established, with Agent Nolan coordinating teams across 3 states simultaneously. Hoffman, his designer suit now rumpled after hours in custody, sat across from Nolan in a high-security interrogation room. "You have 7 minutes before the first termination protocol activates," Hoffman stated coldly, glancing at his expensive watch. "Every facility operates on a different timeline. Miss one check-in and the first group dies." Nolan slid a laptop across the table. "Start talking, now." The facade of the distinguished music producer crumbled as Hoffman rapidly identified 3 locations on a digital map: a private clinic disguised as an exclusive spa in Oregon, an isolated mansion in New Mexico, and a seaside retreat in Maine. His fingers moved with practiced precision, typing access codes that would temporarily override the automated termination systems. The Lazarus wasn't just a research foundation, Nolan later explained to the families gathered in a secure conference room. It was a commercial operation disguised as medical research, providing services to ultra-wealthy clients seeking to extend their lives at any cost. On the screen behind him, a partially decoded client list showed code names instead of identities, with payment values in the millions. Margaret stared at the document, trying to comprehend the monstrous reality behind the sterile financial transactions. The subjects are kept in semi-conscious states for regular extraction of biological material, Hoffman had explained with disturbing detachment. Young, healthy bodies produce specific compounds that dramatically slow aging when properly harvested and administered. Some clients paid up to $50 million annually for treatments. The FBI tactical teams approached the 3 locations simultaneously, their movements coordinated down to the second. At the New Mexico mansion, agents discovered sophisticated medical facilities in the basement, where Jason Peterson and Amber Collins were found in semi-conscious states, multiple surgical scars marking their bodies. In Oregon, agents stormed a clinic operating under the guise of an exclusive anti-aging spa, liberating 3 young people, including Lauren Baker. Dr. Adrian Mercer, a renowned longevity researcher who had disappeared from academia 5 years earlier, was arrested while desperately attempting to destroy records. The main location, a seaside property registered as a meditation and rejuvenation retreat for exclusive clients, held Emily Matthews and Rebecca Torres in an underground medical wing. Unlike the others, they were conscious but profoundly traumatized, having been gradually withdrawn from sedatives to participate in interactive treatments with clients. The reunion between Margaret, David, and Emily occurred at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, where all survivors were transferred for specialized treatment. When Margaret entered the hospital room, she found an almost unrecognizable version of her daughter, thinner, with very short hair and eyes that had witnessed unspeakable horrors. "Mom?" Emily's voice was a harsh whisper, as if rarely used. Margaret rushed to the bedside, carefully embracing her daughter, mindful of the tubes and monitors. David remained frozen in the doorway momentarily, absorbing the reality of his recovered daughter before joining the embrace, openly sobbing. Emily's first coherent words were, "I knew you wouldn't give up." In the days that followed, as her physical strength returned, Emily began sharing fragments of her experience. She vaguely remembered accepting a perfume sample from a security guard, then waking disoriented in an individual cell. The subsequent years were a confusing mixture of medical procedures, pain, and periods of induced unconsciousness. "They called us vessels," she explained during a session with investigators, her mother firmly holding her hand. "They said we were special because our bodies produced something other people needed to live, that we were saving lives." The investigation continued unraveling the extent of Hoffman's operation. In total, 64 victims were identified over 6 years, with only 13 recovered alive. Among the clients, beyond anonymous billionaires, were a senator, 2 Fortune 500 CEOs, and several celebrities, all now facing charges of complicity in kidnapping and illegal human experimentation. Hoffman's trial became the longest and most publicized of the decade. Sitting in the courtroom day after day, Margaret observed the man who had stolen 3 years of her daughter's life, not a mythological monster, but an ordinary-looking businessman who had crossed line after line in the name of profit, gradually converting his legitimate company into a monstrous operation. "The scariest thing," Margaret confided to David one night, "is that he actually believed he was doing something revolutionary. It wasn't just greed, it was a perverted conviction that he was advancing human evolution." 6 months after the rescues, Emily Matthews sat on the porch of her parents' home, where she now lived during her ongoing recovery. Her hair had begun growing again, but the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. Margaret watched through the window as Emily wrote in a journal, part of her therapy. "She still can't sleep without a light on," Margaret told the therapist on the phone, but yesterday she smiled when her old colleague from the hospital visited her. While the investigation continued unveiling the full extent of Hoffman's network, with more than 60 victims identified and only 13 rescued alive, Emily was taking her first steps toward a future different from what she had planned, but still hers to shape. When Margaret asked if she wanted to visit the other survivors for a group session, Emily hesitated briefly before answering, "Yes, I think it's time we build something new from what happened to us."